Dollars to Donuts with your host, Steve Portugal.
Welcome to Dollars to Donuts, the podcast where I talk with the people who lead user research in their organization. I had a profound moment this week. I was facilitating a meeting, not a user research setting at all, but we were having a fairly open-ended conversation. One of the people in the meeting shared some very specific advice for the rest of us, offering almost an impromptu speech or pep talk filled with passion and encouragement, and it was very inspiring. But as the facilitator, and perhaps because of my work as a user researcher, I wondered if maybe that wasn't enough. This person articulated their richly realized state of being, and it may be easy for anyone else to dismiss it. Oh, that's just so-and-so. They're just like that. But we're not born with insight about ourselves or clarity about a new way of being, so I was curious, and I thought it would be helpful to understand more about how this person accomplished this. How did they get here? That might be relevant to the rest of us as we move along our own journey towards this wonderful and ideal state that they were describing. And even though I wasn't asking follow-ups in this session, it seemed like an opportunity to shift my role slightly. And so I asked, how did you get to this stage where you have this clarity in your approach? And this person paused and said, well, if you really want to know, and then proceeded to share very personal details about their life, from hardship through to today, and what they had overcome and how that had shaped them. And the details aren't important for my story, though, and they really belong to the individual who chose to share them, not me. Anyway, it was an impactful moment for all of us in the meeting. And it reminded me about a fundamental in user research, that you don't know what's behind a door. It could be something banal. I mean, it usually is, right? But you don't know until you open it. And sometimes what you'll find is new, surprising, and impactful. But if you assume that it's always banal, you'll never try to cross those thresholds and never have the opportunity to hear those significant perspectives. I'm describing this as a doorway, and that what we do as researchers is step into that space. But I don't think that's sufficient to capture what it is that we do. Yes, we're stepping into something ourselves, but also, and probably most importantly, it's that we're making space for someone else. Choosing to ask that question, to be interested, invites someone else to take a step forward themselves. You can call this a holding environment or a safe space, but I think the additional point I want to make is that it's not just what you do as a user researcher, it's what you do for someone else. Putting out here another episode done without the benefit of a professional editor or transcriptionist. I'm focusing in the near term on how I can contribute, but of course this is a difficult time for many people, including those who operate small businesses. It's a challenge right now for Portugal Consulting. If you're in a position to consider me as a partner, that's appreciated. I lead research projects. I help companies build a more mature research practice, including assessments, training, and coaching. Thank you. Okay, here we go with my conversation with Laith Ullaby, the head of research at Udemy. Well, Laith, thanks so much for being on Dollars to Donuts. It's great to have the chance to speak with you today.
Pleasure to be here. Excited for the conversation.
All right, well, let's get into it. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name's Laith Ullaby. I'm currently the head of research at Udemy, which is an online education platform. Have an academic background in ethnography and have bounced around the UX research world for a few years now. And then I'm also really passionate about teaching. So for the last few years, I've been teaching at the UC Berkeley School of Information and at the UC Berkeley Extension.
So what does it mean to have a degree in ethnography? I feel like that's not a phrase that everyone can say exactly.
Technically, the field that I studied was ethnomusicology, which is using ethnographic methods to look at the intersection of music and popular culture. And so my focus was on how governments in the Middle East were using technology to disseminate national identity through folk culture. So it was a little niche, but it was fun to sort of build that foundation in ethnographic research and think about how sort of the interplay between popular culture and technology.
Are there echoes of that in your daily practice? Like, or can you draw the threads back to what that program was about for you, what that research was about?
For sure. I think that when I think about user research, it's really combining the strands from a lot of different places, different academic places, different, parts of sort of the applied world. And one of those is sort of the design anthropology world, which I think is really steeped in ethnography. And for me, that really raises some of these really interesting questions about identity and community and how we sort of come to understand ourselves, as well as power relationships. So working on a marketplace for education, thinking cross-culturally about, who feels empowered to be a creator of knowledge, I think really harkens back to some of the core areas of exploration that you might encounter in an academic program like that.
Can you say more about the organization where you're at, what Udemy does, and a marketplace for education is a compelling phrase. Maybe you can unpack that.
So as opposed to some other awesome companies in the space, we're not a publisher, we're a marketplace. And so we have a platform for instructors to come and to find learners. So just to get a sort of sense of the scale, we have 50 million students, 57,000 instructors, and over 150,000 courses. So, in other models, we might say, hey, here's sort of the Python course that we think is cool. And in our model, any instructor can come on and make any variation of a Python course. And then it's those sort of marketplace dynamics like reviews and number of enrollments and social proof and those kind of things, like you might do on a e-commerce platform that folks would be familiar with, in which students then get to evaluate what's the right course for their learning need. So it's really exciting to sort of see that proliferation, and that there's so many different approaches to finding the right student, the right course with the right instructor at the right time. It can be overwhelming. There's obviously, I'm sure a lot of folks' minds are going to that moment of overload of too many options. So we do try and help out with that, but that's sort of the core value proposition of what Udemy does.
And so as a researcher in a marketplace company, I'm going to guess that there's research focused on, when you describe two players in the marketplace, right? The instructors and the students.
Correct.
Would you describe research as kind of focusing on alternately one or the other?
Yeah, and that's kind of the fun part is, I think sometimes if we're thinking about sort of the very naive version of user research, it's, we're trying to help out the one user. And, for us, it gets more complicated because you have to think about that balance. And so, you can make something a lot easier for the learners, but that could put a huge burden on the instructor. And so you have to be able to triangulate and sort of balance those. Similarly, we also have a B2B offering. So in that world, there's also an administrator role or sort of a buyer role that can enter the fray as well. So we have to then sometimes think about the balance and trying to find win-win-wins for any kind of change that we do. So it's definitely a bigger challenge at times, but it's a fun one.
So in that third example, the B2B, so this is a scenario where that Python course might be used by like a learning development person inside an organization to bring that in for training. Is that the scenario?
Exactly. And so we have soft skills, we have technical skills, there's a whole range, and that is a subscription model. So they would get access to our courses through that subscription model and make it available to their employees.
So what kinds of research are you and your colleagues doing?
One thing that I really love about Udemy is over 2/3 of our learners are outside of the United States. So we really have this global presence. And as a researcher, just as a nerdy researcher, that presents a lot of fun stuff to look at. But it also means that we tend to rely a lot on remote research just to be able to get that global perspective, that global reach for the studies that we do. So remote is a lot. But it's interesting you bring this up because I've been talking with my team a lot about how, I think sometimes both individual researchers and organizations can kind of fall into a comfort zone with where, how, and when they do research. And so we've been talking a lot about ways to kick ourselves out of our comfort zone and make sure that when we're designing research, it's truly the best way to answer that particular immediate research question that's staring us in the face, rather than something that has a lower logistical overhead or just as something that we're more confident or more comfortable doing.
So how do you create the conditions where, you're talking about risk, you didn't use that word, but outside your comfort zone, how do you create the conditions where it's okay to go outside the comfort zone for you, your team, the stakeholders that you work with?
Absolutely. And I think, you hit the nail on the head with risk. It's not that folks oftentimes don't want to do these things. It's that, they are used to doing things well and they want to maintain that same level that they uphold themselves to. I think there's a few things that help there. One is, as I've helped to build upon my predecessor who previously led the research team and build the team further, really tried to have complementary and overlapping skill sets within the team. So hopefully it's not something that no one on the team has done. It might be something that one person hasn't done or a few people haven't done. So this way we can share and teach each other. I'm a big fan of when they talk about in the medical practice, they talk about see one, do one, teach one. And that's kind of how you know a new procedure in medicine. So I really tried to embrace that and say, hey, folks, how can we teach each other? Because you might have seen someone do something and then you got to do it yourself. And now you get to teach someone. That's when you've really kind of got that level of mastery. So when you're constructing teams, I think it's interesting to think about where those opportunities are and that you're creating the environment for that. I think we're also lucky to work at a place where there's just a lot of trust in the research team. Folks have just done a good job of delivering high quality research, and that gets you a tremendous amount of goodwill. And so I think that's allowed us to have a little higher risk tolerance because people know that, we're trying our best and we're trying to deliver good research. And if something, by chance didn't go super great, it was done with the sort of the best faith and intent. And just generally the leadership, the product leadership and other folks are trying to encourage that general behavior in terms of the features that we're launching or the ways that we're interacting with our marketing messages or things like that too. So it helps to be in an organization that generally understands, that risk is something there. And that's where you get a lot of growth.
Buried within that is there's a specific nugget that you just said I want to kind of bring back up. You implicitly answered, how do you build trust? And you said, deliver great work. I'm paraphrasing you. Do I have that correct?
I think that's a big part of it for sure.
But then you kind of talked about goodwill, and maybe good work engenders goodwill, which then gives you some permission to I know you're not talking about failing, but you're talking about, getting outside the comfort zone and having trust to do that.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Hopefully there's a little bit of a virtuous cycle, that happens there. And I'd say the other part of it is sometimes research can be a black box. And so I think that as people understand the component parts that go into research, it helps to build that empathy. And I know, empathy is a little bit of a loaded term and has been critiqued in some ways. But I think that just sort of that base level of having a better understanding of what other folks are doing. And I think that, even just having folks observing research sessions or participating or the research team facilitating non-researchers doing research helps to build up that kind of understanding of the complexity and the nuance that goes into, really high quality research. So I think that's part of it as well.
When you try to move research from a black box to something that has nuance, you're asking more of your audience, of your stakeholders. I want you to understand that there's more to this than what you knew. And maybe this is the benefit of working in a company that has learning as part of its mission. But you're asking more of your collaborators if you want them to understand what you do as more than a black box. That's more work. That's more brain cycles that you're asking of them. I feel like this comes up in the discussion of, research is a thing that everyone's doing. You just talked about facilitating teams, guiding them and doing their own research. As a practice, we have invited a lot of people in, and yet we still want to highlight the difference between what a non-researcher can do and what we can do. But that means showing somebody that, hey, it's not a black box. There's a lot of detail here. I'm probably asking like 8 questions at once here. Do you know where I'm going?
I think I do. And I think this is something, every research org I've been in has struggled with this in one form or another. So I think I get the gist of it. I think for me, there's a few things. The first is it's been a bit of an evolution for me. I think coming in as someone with a bit of an academic background and originally being more on the consultancy side, we sort of positioned ourselves as like separation of church and state of like design and research. And so we really kind of saw ourselves as on the user side. Maybe, the metaphor I might use is something like we were the scientists or we were the sort of the testers in a way. And I think as I've moved in-house and just fundamentally tried to have different relationships, I've had to reformulate how I think about my relationship with product teams. And, I'm someone who can't code. I'm not a designer. I love all those kind of things, but I just don't have that skill set. And I think for a long time, I didn't see myself as a builder. And one of the big evolutions in my career has been saying, hey, I'm part of a team that are building things. And so it's not me sort of on the outside, as a referee, but I'm part of this team that's building something. And there has to be that kind of give and take. And I think that repositioning of myself has also helped to allow folks to reposition position themselves in relation to me, and has opened up some of those kind of things. But you're absolutely right. Researchers can't just sort of demand that everyone drop all the things that they're doing and have all the bandwidth in the world for extensive kind of things, because they are very time intensive, especially the more elaborate research projects. So there's a few things there, again, echoing that idea of, not just being empathetic with our users, but being empathetic with our colleagues and our coworkers, I think is super important. I think that the principles of human-centered design in what we ask them to do is super important as well. So if you're soliciting feedback on a discussion guide, have you made that a really easy to read guide? Have you set up what kind of feedback you're asking for them in a really clear and manageable way? Have you tried to maybe anticipate their workload? I think all the things that we might think about doing in terms of building products, we need to be able to do for our colleagues in different ways. But I think it also just shows that, for research to be really supercharged and have the impact that it can, it's a team sport. And when we think about sort of those models of UX maturity or research maturity, part of it is that the organization is willing to invest in it. When I think about democratizing research, it's not just about letting a designer go and sort of being the gatekeeper and letting them go do some usability sessions, but it's about, having them more involved in the process and feeling that we're all designers, we're all researchers, we're all product managers, we're all engineers. Now we have specializations within that, but we're building together. And I think that helps, but it's still tough. I don't mean to act like I've nailed it and I have all the answers, but that mindset shift has at least helped a little bit.
Right, because you started off saying that, you never thought of yourself as a builder, but I hear you evolving that identity for yourself. And I heard two things. So I just want to check them with you.
Yeah.
One is the collective view. We are building something and I am part of the we. And if we are building, then I, in this case, you, take on some of that mantle of the identity of a builder because you're part of that team.
Absolutely.
I heard that. And I also heard that in living up to the principles of empathy for our colleagues, you are designing experiences for them through the artifacts that you're creating and the ways that you're trying to make it effective for them to work with you. And that's something that's being built. You are a builder in the production and facilitation and production and artifacts and all the sort of bits and pieces that make research happen.
So like a lot of tech companies, we do a lot of playing off the sort of name of the company. So, people that work at Udemy or Udemates and things like that. So one thing that my team has worked on over the last few quarters is to make an internal self-serve research process that we call You Do You. So it's, a play on the you in the name of Udemy, but it's sort of the idea that you can do it yourself. And we approached it in very much the same way that a product team might approach it, in terms of we basically had one of the researchers act as a PM. And we put together materials and we decided, what was in scope and what was out of scope. We sketched out the user flow and what it might be. We tried to figure out how the different pieces of the experience would fit together and tried to create a portal through which folks could do this with as little friction as possible. And we very much approached it how a design team or, a product team might make a product, because we wanted to, sort of practice what we preach and embrace those principles. And we're iterating on it and we're doing user testing on it. And, we're trying to do all those things so that it can evolve and be the best way that folks can do research themselves.
How did it feel for the team to do that, to take on these, put on some different hats and kind of act as if you were these other types of roles?
Well, I will say, just because you brought up the issue of feeling, which I think is important, is I think that, for different folks on the team, this was more and less out of their comfort zone. I know that there can sometimes be that gut reaction when we think about sort of opening the gates and letting non-researchers, run wild. And so there was some good, fun discussions about, how we saw ourselves and how we talked about research. And some folks really kind of had to grin and say, hey, I'm going to trust the process and see how this goes. So that was a fun kind of thing to go through. But definitely it was great to see folks taking on these other roles and, maybe putting some of their design chops to use, that they maybe don't think of themselves as a designer, but they've picked up some of those skills along different ways, or put some of their PM chops together and kind of see, put into practice what they'd seen great PMs doing. So it was a really fun process. And I think it was a fun bonding process. We kind of did it as part of an offsite. We have one awesome researcher, but she's located in Dublin. Dublin, Ireland, so we don't always get to spend as much time with her. So we did the bulk of this work, sort of did a sprint when she was visiting, the main office in San Francisco. So it was also just a really fun way to get to know each other and our working styles, because we're in an embedded model. And so folks are working with teams. And so it was just really fun to be able to work on a project together and kind of learn from each other about how we approach product design and product development. So just as a team bonding experience, I thought we got tremendous value out of it on top of sort of the output in addition.
You mentioned empathy for your colleagues. Trying to do the work of a role that you don't normally hold, I think might illustrate that as well for everybody.
Absolutely.
So just maybe shifting gears a little bit, thinking about the populations, the user groups, and sort of this space of learning, of teaching and learning. Are there unique ways that you have to approach, beyond the global aspect, whether it's methods or just, the mindset you have to bring to these particular areas that you want to understand? Is there anything specific there?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a similar thing that you might find with financial services, some forms of that, or the fitness world, where folks have a lot of aspiration to do a lot of learning, but it takes a pretty big investment to learn a new skill, especially if it's in a more self-directed environment. So a lot of times it's that classic thing of, someone might, if you talk to someone right after they purchase a course, they're imagining this sort of future where they're diligently doing, 3 hours a day and 10 hours on the weekend and, things like that. And, unsurprisingly, a lot of folks struggle with that, whether it's their current work responsibilities or home responsibilities, or, they hit a stumbling block and they're not sure how to get over it. So it can be a challenge to parse between sort of how people imagine themselves behaving and then reconciling that with maybe what we see in the data analytics or sort of what they do. There's some interesting behavioral science things about the more you can empathize with your future self, the more effective you can do at helping that future state. So, there was a company in Mexico, and they would digitize an aged version of your face when you were presented with like how much you wanted to contribute to your retirement fund, and sort of being able to empathize with yourself in the future made people more likely to contribute to themselves, basically their own retirement fund, because they could sort of imagine themselves as not being distinct in the future, but being the same person. So there's a lot of challenges there around motivation and intent versus behavior. That was a little bit of a rambling answer, but it's a complicated research area to dive into.
How do you approach the instructor community or segment?
Definitely marketplace dynamics can be a challenge. If you have an entrenched instructor who's very popular and has, hundreds of thousands of enrollments, it can be tough to figure out, well, what if a new instructor comes on? So helping folks to kind of feel that they have a fair shot is super important. And then also there's a few elements I think that are really important about helping instructors get the right kind of feedback. At both Udemy and other places I've worked, if you ask folks if they want more analytics and you start listing options, they'll just say like, yes, 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 yes. People just feel that they want more data and they want more information. But at some point it can be overwhelming, or if they don't know what to do with it, sometimes folks can kind of feel guilty and, this number is changing and I don't know what I'm doing differently and things like that. So there's a real challenge in helping to not just present information on a dashboard, but the context, the understanding, the nuance, and hopefully equip them with strategies or suggestions along the way. And they're not just sort of twisting in the wind to sort of decipher the different data visualizations, how they might do without that assistance.
Right. And there's something maybe lurking underneath your stories about, the gap between, maybe at a simplistic level, like what people say they want or how we can get people to agree that features are things that they want versus serving a deeper need, which is harder to extract and kind of and have a deep understanding of. And that sounds like that's the difference of what you're trying to accomplish with research.
Absolutely. And, that's kind of the in some ways, the holy grail of a lot of the work that we do is figuring out how to get at that, underlying unmet need and things like that. And I've even seen, it's been interesting recently, a few teams working on similar product offerings or features, and then realizing when we took a step back that, hey, these might actually be trying to solve some similar things. We might be able to combine these efforts. And I think that's one thing that research was helpful in, is sort of highlighting what the actual value people were getting out of some of these prototypes. And it helped to sort of triangulate what sort of, had the most juice, that we thought could really deliver something unique.
We talked about your team kind of indirectly. Can you describe what kind of skills and backgrounds, make up your team? And in future, what do you look for when you meet prospective candidates for your team?
I think that we have a pretty diverse range of backgrounds, which is pretty cool. At Udemy, the way we're just organized, it's market research and user research together. And, this is something I think is really interesting in the industry, is all the different permutations of org charts and, where folks sit and things like that. I think sometimes it can get over indexed as something that's important, because I think sometimes it's often just legacies of how companies grow, but it's interesting. And I think it is good to think about. So we have one market researcher and then 4 user researchers and then myself. And it's actually been really fun because to have that market research lens as part of the user research team, because it really helps to highlight things about brand voice and brand positioning and sort of that more holistic experience of how someone might enter the product through different campaigns and sort of thinking about that broader journey. So it's been fun to have that perspective. Most of the places I've worked at before, market research is in a different building and it's kind of a black box even internally. So it's cool to have that together. And that person tends to bring a little bit more of the survey chops and some of those more market research kind of things. Not to say that user research doesn't do surveys, but, sort of bread and butter and approaching some different kinds of questions. And then on the user research team, we've got a couple folks that have a master's degree in HCI, and then other couple of folks that, came to the industry through different routes, including someone who formerly used to be an engineer working on renewable energy in that kind of format. So it's cool to that we all bring in different things, and we've been at some different organizations and sort of trying to figure out the DNA of those places and what we want to sort of copy and what we hope to innovate on, or what we see that someone might be bringing in a different mousetrap. When I'm looking at candidates, Udemy is very mission driven, even though it's a company. A lot of folks really just believe in education and the power of education and the global nature of what we do. So always want folks that are really bought in to the idea of what we're doing. And then I think beyond that, it's, someone that can bring in something new, and that can be new methods, new perspectives, new approaches. But I don't really see it as that there's like a one single profile that is gonna mesh well. Collaboration, of course, is super important, and having that flexibility to think about, for each project, what sort of permutations or iterations, is this something that's going to be a little more quick and dirty? Is this something that's going to be a little more rigorous? The last area that in hiring that I've sort of formulated in my mind is, I think about written communication, verbal communication, and visual communication. And I really want to find folks who are really comfortable at least one of those, like really good. And then hopefully, decent at the other two, and, willing to kind of work on them. But I think it's important that you have one modality of communication that, you're just really good at, because, so much of what we do is communication.
I want to loop back to, you said all sorts of interesting things. I want to loop back to one of them, because you mentioned a few moments ago that people are embedded, but you also talked about the see one, do one, teach one. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm just wondering about, especially you got this market researcher with a pretty unique skill set among your team, and you have all this diversity. The researchers are embedded. They have product teams they're specifically focused on. So how do you balance that focus and then harness that diversity and let people influence each other and teach each other and draw from that team? That you have the centralized part and you have the embedded part. I'm wondering what that looks like.
Yeah. And I think this is a challenge for folks in some organizations to sort of be a functional leader, but not a project leader, where the folks on my team are just so much more expert in the details of the features and pods that they're working on. So, sometimes I feel like, oftentimes I feel like, they're teaching me, or they're, showing me how things are working. And so I have to think about other ways that I can contribute or add value. Obviously, that can be with being a sounding board board for thinking about methods and approaches. But to your point, there's also about sort of how I can create that sense of a research team, even though most of our day-to-day is kind of off embedded with, awesome designers and engineers and marketers and, folks doing other things. So we have a few mechanisms. And, I hate to say that the answer to everything is a meeting, but some of it is meetings. So we have a team meeting. We also have a biweekly session we call it Researchers Talk Shop. And so we have a spreadsheet where people just throw in topics and we meet for lunch and we try and dive into different research topics. So that's a great way for, someone's been doing a lot of workshops recently and they can kind of share what went well and what didn't go well. We do some of that in our research team as well. We have office hours as well. So people can just stop in and talk with us, but we, sort of hang out in a conference room. And that's just an opportunity for us to kind of catch up a little as well, because sometimes, 10 people show up to office hours and sometimes it's just one. And just kind of hearing each other helping other folks in office hours, you kind of get to hear a little about their approaches and things like that. Another mechanism that we have is we do try and pick some bigger, juicier questions that we are sort of more researcher initiated, and we do those collaboratively. So the UDU initiative is an example of that, and we've tried to do a few other collaborative researcher initiated projects. Another thing is we have a little podcast club, so we'll listen to podcast episodes and then just set up a quick little half hour to talk through it in different ways. And it's just fun, a chance for researchers to talk about things through that lens and try and grow and get those other perspectives. For me, the nice thing about podcasts is it feels really low friction to just find like a 20 or 30 minute podcast. Folks can do that when they're commuting to or from work, and you can still have a really lively discussion. I found historically it can be a lot harder to give folks PDFs or articles. It can be harder to sort of find the time. So those are some of the mechanisms that we have to try and develop that sense of community and exchange.
There's a lot of them. And so just, I know you've got one person in Dublin. Mm-hmm. For the people that are in San Francisco, are you sitting are you co-located or?
We're all sitting on the same floor, but it's a decent sized floor. So, there's folks that aren't in visual range. So we're kind of sitting near the product teams that we work with. We're sort of the seating chart is by product teams rather than by functional teams. But, you run into people constantly just in the halls and at lunch and running between meetings. So definitely I see everyone, I'd say at least a couple times every day, even if it's just passing.
And so for researchers that are embedded in these product teams, how is sort of the plan for what they're going to work on determined?
Shortly before I joined the company, or a little before I joined the company, the research team had switched from that more centralized model to an embedded model. And so some of this has been an iterative process. The other challenge is, there's just not infinite research resources. So the ratio of researchers to designers and PMs, there's usually one researcher juggling at least a couple PMs, if not two or three or even more. So it makes prioritization really a challenge. And I think before we'd been a little reactive, and it's hard to make sure that you're working on the right things if there's just sort of like a queue coming in and you're trying to keep your head above water. So one of the things we've worked on and iterated on it quite a bit over every quarter is just to do a quarterly planning process where folks go out as teams are putting together their, quarterly OKRs. Researchers are also evaluating what the research asks will be over the next quarter. The researchers then take that all together, from across the teams, think about, they do a little bit of a t-shirt sizing, what's a small, medium, and large project, think about their bandwidth, sort of think about timing, and come up with sort of a proposal. It's very aspirational, but it's still a really good, exercise to go through. Now, what I think has made it really effective is we then do a readout of these plans to leadership. So I'm really lucky to have a very actively involved CEO and CTO and head of product. And so it's those folks and a few others in a room, and each researcher goes through what they're intending to do over that quarter. Now, it's really great for research just in terms of getting visibility and, getting some recognition, because we also do a section where we sort of share what we thought were some of the wins and do a little bit of a retro on the last quarter. So gives some of the researchers a chance to highlight some of the great work that they're doing to leadership. And then also just to get that feedback where they might talk about what they're prioritizing, and then to get that color or get that really strategic perspective from the CEO talking about, why he's excited to hear us diving into this area or that area. And then the last part that I think is kind of powerful as well is then if there's kind of pushback a few weeks later as a researcher's explaining like, oh, I'd really love to get to that, but I'm doing this, they can kind of say, well, this is what our, leadership team, thought was really important. It gives a little more gravitas to that sort of prioritization process. And of course, we build in, feedback cycles, throughout as we're developing this as well. So it really hopefully gets folks on the same page. There can be a little overhead to this. So we are trying to make this as svelte and sort of low overhead. So that's part of what we're iterating on. And this might not scale if we were a team of 15, because there just wouldn't be time to, have the CEO sit there through 15 people's presentations. So at least for now, it's been really valuable. And, we're going to have to think about as the team grows, how to modify it.
There's a lot there. So the researchers themselves, they're the ones putting together their individual roadmaps.
Yeah. Going back to that question about, building teams, I want folks who are, I want to find awesome folks and empower them to do the work. I'm not, overseeing or micromanaging or sort of telling them to do this or that. They tend to bring me stuff and we chat about it, and I'm a sounding board and we strategize and I give my perspective. But, they're the ones that are mediating the relationship with their stakeholders. And so, they really have to believe in whatever choices are being made about what they're working on. And I also want them to feel that they have agency, that they're not just sort of, designers sometimes talk about sort of being like pixel pushers. I don't know what the right alliteration would be for researchers. Maybe we could work on that, but don't want researchers to feel like they're just sort of being dictated to about do this usability test or do this, generative, exploration or get me a survey. Again, making them part of the process and they're contributing to the OKR process as well. So it's really should be a symbiotic relationship. We're not quite there, but I think we're really moving in the right direction, and I'm excited about that back and forth and the interplay.
I think it's a compelling vision that you're illustrating. And I want to go slightly meta here.
Sure.
Or maybe too meta. I don't know. You said something that I think is quite common, right? The research resources are limited.
Yeah.
Or to put it another way, demand exceeds supply. And I think that's common. And I wonder, outside of Udemy, like if that's sort of a truth in tech, in the kinds of organizations that, there's lots of kinds of research, but in sort of tech overall, I think that's a common, you have different team sizes, you have different organization approaches to research, but in general, I hear this a lot. What do we think of that? Like if that's sort of a universal truth that there's more needs than there are resources. Why? So what? Do you have any reflection on that?
I mean, there's definitely, I think we should be self-critical enough to say we're biased as researchers. So, I see research need where perhaps other people don't. And I think that's totally fair. And I think it's also the tricky part is, are you optimizing for peak demand load or average demand load? And that can be a hard thing to disentangle. And then lastly, I think it's where and how can research impact things? So, are we sort of cleaning up things and grinding out a lot of usability studies? Are we doing really conceptual, blue sky kind of research? What kind of impact do those different things have? What sets of stakeholders are we interfacing with? I think it's a very different situation if you're getting into some really interesting things that overlap with back-end engineering and you're doing interesting things with PMM and local operations team. You know what I'm saying? Instead of just sort of the more core conventional stakeholders that you might have. I think that exploring those kind of things are maybe things that I'm seeing that I wish I could do if I had more bandwidth, but the organization might not necessarily see that yet or see the value. And so it's a matter of sort of picking the opportunities to try and demonstrate how big the menu of research is and all the places that we can impact. So it is a tricky one. And it's probably better to have too few researchers than to go the other way.
Certainly when I started in the field, there wasn't a lot of demand. I mean, there wasn't as much awareness. There wasn't as much process that includes these tools and kind of incorporates what we bring. And it's been interesting to see over time how the demand is high. The amount that our work is integrated with other work that's happening in the company has grown. And I think you're articulating, a future state perhaps where there's even more aspects of the work that a company is doing are places where we can bring value. I don't know what the shape of the curve is over time, but you can sort of see it evolving from who are you guys to we have a lot of work for you to in the future, there's way more that we can do than people are maybe ready for or that we have demonstrated, as a practice as broadly.
Absolutely. I mean, as I've grown in this field, I've really found that, human-centered design has kind of permeated my life. Let's say I'm trying to set up a time to hang out with some friends. And, it's sometimes hard to coordinate everything with like 3 or 4 friends. When I'm typing up that email, I think about, a little visual hierarchy in, as I type this out to make people understand the options and what I'm asking for and to reduce the language and make it easier to scan, that goes into me putting together that email. So I think we kind of have to embrace that philosophy of human-centered design is really powerful. And it's been fun, to your point, of seeing some of the bigger companies where the internal, human resources team or the real estate team might have a user researcher because they're thinking about that's a product, how people access the benefits internally or what workspaces are like at a company or all these different kinds of applications. And that whether we call it user research or service design or, any of these kind of, but that fundamental approach can benefit organizations in so much of what they're doing. It is fun to think about that future state and all the places that we can, deliver value.
And you set up top, you came from academia, you had sort of just a variety of things that you'd done along the way in research and kind of before research. I'm wondering if you kind of look at your history, but also as you grew into the field, you, I think, learned about the history of the field of user research. Do you see, are there seeds of what we're talking about if you look backwards in where research had been applied, how it kind of evolved, or, what you see when you look backwards?
Yeah, this is a topic that I'm just continually fascinated by. And I would love your perspective on this because I'm sure you know a lot of this very well. And it's been interesting. I think sometimes when I'm doing my teaching, I almost get the sense my students kind of feel like this is how it is and this is how it's always been. And, sometimes I kind of have to remind them a little and be like, this is actually a very rapidly evolving and changing field. And you all are going to have a huge say in sort of what this ultimately looks like or sort of what it might look like in a more mature state. And it really has undergone these different shifts in thinking about all the different strands that go into it at a very, very simplified level. And not to say that these phases are not overlapping or exclusive, but it feels like, previously there had sort of been the innovation labs, the Xerox parks, and that had been sort of where a lot of this kind of work was being done. Obviously, there's a older history when you're thinking about World War I and II and human factors, and that's another sort of strand in this. And then it feels like some of this work then became a little more focused around agencies. You've got your IDOs and things like that. And we started to see that shift to in-house research happening and calling it UX and things like that. And I think around then is also when we saw the shift to much more consumer-oriented products. Before, a lot of it, had been very enterprisey or business-oriented, where maybe someone all their exposure to human-computer interaction would be the one computer at work or something like that. And so over this time, we've evolved to this place where technology is being much more omnipresent, and you're not just dealing with the technology of one manufacturer, but you're starting to have to think about that the design changes on your phone are affecting the design changes on your computer, and those might be made by different software companies and hardware companies and all these kind of things. Now, I think originally a lot of those in-house teams were were centralized, like I had sort of talked about a little before, and then we've seen this shift to the more embedded teams and the real just tremendous growth that's happened over, the last 5 to 8 years, and weaving together all these different strands from psychology and design and information science and anthropology and, more than I could sort of name. And we've also seen the pipeline really emerge of these really great master's programs A lot of programs in library science have rebranded themselves as an information science program and are contributing to this. And of course, human-computer interaction programs and things like that. So it's interesting to think about sort of what comes next. I started to see some more innovation labs kind of things popping up. So it's funny how that might be coming back into vogue. And then the sort of rage of democratizing research and sort of figuring out how to scale the impact of research teams beyond just embedding more and more researchers is interesting, as well as, sort of the global nature of this. It feels like there's a bit of a different UX culture in some parts of Europe, and you're seeing an emerging UX culture in other parts of the world too. So that's kind of my take that I've gathered through just a few articles and chatting with folks. But I'd actually be curious if that aligns as sort of a very rough arc with sort of your take of the field.
So this is the part of the interview. This is the danger of interviewing an interviewer. They turn it around on you. Yeah, I mean, I would love to sort of, and maybe someone has done this, but I'd love, there's a visualization. It's kind of a timeline with some of these major things happening. And, as you talk about it, the emergence of design and consumer products has elevated design, right? The way the jobs for designers changed once there was an iPhone. I mean, going back, the jobs for designers changed once there was like a Macintosh computer. But I have felt for a lot of my career that, and not necessarily in a bad way, but that research is kind of following in the wake of design.
Absolutely. When
I joined the field, it was following in the wake of industrial design, because that's where all the innovation was happening. And, they kind of were the innovation labs. But then the web comes along, and there's just so much growth and, the things that you talked about. And so user experience comes along as a phrase, and suddenly we're user experience researchers, not design researchers, because we're working on that. In those industries, we're working on digital stuff more exclusively. And I think, in your narrative, you are, as any good history has to do, it includes a lot of different, as you call them, strands. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I feel like it's necessary, but it's hard to see the research strands. Like, you don't want to decontextualize it, but I do want to decontextualize. Like, how do we talk about research without talking about anything else? Just as a thought exercise, like just to look at how research has changed, even though these other things have changed, and that's why research has changed. But I'm certainly interested in I think, your point about a lot of the work moving in-house, and as someone that's still a consultant, I can tell you that's definitely true. It really has changed my professional life, changed dramatically as that trend took hold. So I feel that one very specifically. And that's a very research specific one, even though I think you see lots of creative professions that were historically done as consultancies or done as agencies got moved in-house. I feel like that Apple caused some sea change in the ad industry when they brought something in-house. And I don't know if that was sort of the change point that led to what you're describing with, research overall.
I think that if I were to focus a little more on the research strand, because I think it's a fair call out, I would say there's two things. And one is thinking about the position that the researcher has vis-a-vis the product or what they're working on. And it's funny because I think, back in the day, and I'll contradict myself a little about focusing on research, but, if you were a designer, you'd be like, oh, I want to go work for Fjord or T-Hand & Lax or, these kind of big design agencies. And they all got either acquired or acqui-hired, not all of them, but a lot of the really prestigious ones. And you saw that happening a little with research too, with Bolt Peters, and things like that getting brought in-house by the big companies, Adaptive Path and things like that. So it has been interesting to see that transition. But I think we've inherited certain ways of approaching things, or at least I have. I know coming from that consulting side, it was kind of a formal relationship that I had with the product and with the product teams. And, it's sort of like having the big bloated deck, that Edward Tufte would, shake his finger at me for putting together. And I've had to think about ways of thinking about like, hey, I don't really need to go through a lot of that front matter that I might have had in this very formal deck for clients with people that I have a much more casual relationship with. Similarly at Udemy, when we first transferred from that embedded, centralized to embedded form, they'd been sending out surveys, sort of satisfaction surveys to see like, how did the research project goes? And ultimately, if there are people that you're in meetings with all day and you're sitting next to them and all these kind of things, it feels kind of odd and distancing to send that satisfaction survey. Now, we still need to have mechanisms for feedback and to figure out ways to do better, but we kind of needed to adapt the ways in which we work to reflect these different relationships. And I guess the other way I'd flip it around is sort of to take a research design thinking approach, which is, if we were to redesign research today and could somehow throw away the baggage or sort of the history of all these things, how would we design it differently? How would we redesign the way we work and our relationship with products, allowing that there would probably be a spectrum of those things depending on the company and those kind of things. It would be, as a further thought experiment, it would be kind of fun to think about what are the things that we've carried forward because of these histories coming out of industrial design and out of human factors and out of these sort of evolutions, and what are the things that we might do differently if we'd been on a different path or we're just starting anew today.
I think one of the legacies, and whether it's a strength or a weakness or both, is the diversity of paths that have led people to research. Which it's still true today. If you go back in the olden times, there were few sort of credible paths. They had to sort of invent a path. And now there are, I think, many paths that are somewhat credible, but it's still lots of people have to find their way in from something else.
Right.
The field welcomes more people from more places. It's still a struggle to get in. It was a different struggle in the past, but that lack of definition of what background does a researcher have or what backgrounds, plural, does a research team need to have, I think that's very exciting, but it also seems like a huge amount of legacy code that we spend a lot of energy and emotion on, that if we were looking at things to sort of toss away and reinvent from scratch, that would be one that I would lobby for. Yeah,
it's tough. And I think a consequence of that is the research culture at different organizations can be so different. If you have one place and a lot of the folks are master's degrees in human computer interaction, and not saying that that's a bad thing, but that's just a set of things. And you have another organization that more folks coming out of sort of design anthropology or applied anthropology, they're going to have very different ways of framing problems and approaching things. And you might have another organization where it's a lot of designers and engineers who, learned and got into research, through work experience. Those would all have very different flavors. And yeah, to your point, it's kind of like a great thing and it's an exciting thing and it's an enriching thing, but it can lead to folks talking past each other or, getting in over their heads in certain situations. I do sometimes, my main concern can be about the ethical conducting of research. And that, I really hope that everyone who gets to do this awesome line of work has the proper, ethical, training to sort of keep their eye out for getting into situations that are not good for them, are not good for the industry, and are not good for the research subjects.
And where does that, I think this speaks to the multidiscipline. I guess that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So I'm just reiterating your point for you. Sorry. But where does that come from? How do research teams, regardless of what their composition is, how do we mature the practice of the ethical aspect of the work?
It's tough. I think that there needs to be a degree of self-policing, whether it's on Slack communities or email listservs. I think it's okay to discuss things that have popped up and say, hey, I'm seeing the survey coming out from this, or an invitation to participate in research like this. And, I don't know how I feel about that. Definitely, I'd say larger teams, which I think is where a lot of more junior folks are able to get their start. I would love to see them have a sort of a formal cadence of doing some ethics training. I think it's super important. But yeah, I think there is a bit of a vacuum there. There's some good articles, and it does get covered in the seminal works like the Baxter Courage Kane understanding user needs. There's great discussions in there about ethics and things like that. But I definitely think as an industry we could be doing more.
And goes back to the strands thing, like the conversation about ethics in user experience progresses a certain way. And it's easy for us as researchers to get sort of swept up in that, but the issues are different. And I think there are specific things, as you're kind of getting at.
Yeah, I think that the things you'd watch out for if you're doing academic psych experiments in grad school would be very different from if you're doing anthropological field research, let's say with a marginalized community. But yet in industry, because of the wonderful interdisciplinariness, you might have those folks sort of doing the other kind of research and not being fully abreast of the, even if they have very advanced ethical training and research ethics training in their home discipline, as they move and sort of get to experience the other strands, they might not be totally, up to speed on those other kinds of areas. So even as folks that think they have really great, human-centered research ethics training, as we move into this UX research world, there needs to be something sort of specific for us. I will say that the UXPA has guidelines. Market research organizations have ethical guidelines, and I think those are a really fantastic starting point for the work that we do because they're focused on sort of this more applied or industry setting. But there's a lot more that I think we could do collectively.
What do you see in your students in terms of their awareness or hunger for this kind of guidance?
I don't know how representative Berkeley is. I think it tends to attract a little bit more of the mission-driven or idealistic kind of folks. So I know that whenever I've mentioned doing work with different kinds of communities or crossing socioeconomic status, sort of working with folks in a broader spectrum, not necessarily just, Bay Area folks that have an iPhone, 11, I think that they really get excited to think about those kind of things, and they really embrace the responsibility and recognize the privilege that they have. I have to say, I'm just so impressed and blown away by how sophisticated the students are. I feel that they're really attuned to some of these kind of things, and you just have to open the door a tiny bit, and they tend to really jump at the chance to sort of think through some of these really complex issues and think about the ramifications of sound design of people that, have different accents, or AR, VR for accessibility and things like that. They're connecting the dots really quickly. I just think it's really important to give them sort of the frameworks through which to process these kind of things. So that's kind of what I see to be my challenge.
Your challenge is to give them those frameworks too.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it kind of helps to see like the bigger picture a little easier.
Yeah. Well, this is super interesting, and we could obviously get into all of this 2 or 3 times more than we already did. I guess just to throw it to you, like, what didn't I ask you about or that you want to talk about that we didn't get to?
I don't know. I'm a nerd. I can talk about anything for forever, as if you can't tell from the conversation. But, I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about some of the historical stuff. And just quite frankly, like outside of the interview, would love it if you had any more perspective on that to share, just because I think it's interesting to think about that legacy. But I don't really have any other, axes to grind or anything, if you feel you got enough.
So I'll throw one more question at you, and then I'll try for a perspective on, on the strands conversation,
okay, perfect.
I guess. So if our conversation on Dollars to Donuts was going to end up in Podcast Club, what would you want people to get out of it?
I think I'm really into the idea of sort of questioning what we do. And again, that can be the methods and that conversation about getting out of our comfort zone. It can be thinking about our relationships with stakeholders and trying to reimagine and iterate on those. And it can be thinking about the historical trajectory of the field and the legacies that has imbued us with. And I think that just sort of being ready to iterate and question the assumptions that a lot of those things are built on is the thing that I'd really want folks to come away with.
Excellent. I said I would try to offer something else on the sort of looking forward, looking back on the field piece. My perspective is both informed and I guess hampered by just time. Like I have been doing this for, more than 2 decades, which is weird what to say when it comes out of my mouth, but it's true. And I have just been feeling for the last little while that, we've been on this trajectory, this gentle upward slide in terms of, I don't know, skill building, like figuring stuff out, building best practices, like a lot of things that we were, making up as we went along have been formalized, have been shared, have been documented. There are, for a talk I was doing, I tried to gather up as many books about research that are out there, and there is a lot, like just so many of them. And that's a good thing. We're talking about this expertise is being documented and shared. And I've been feeling in the past year or so, and again, it's only my perspective. It's not a declaration of what's real or true, but I have been feeling like that we're like any sort of, maybe you have a better take on this as someone who helps people build skills or do learning, right? You advance at a certain rate and then you kind of reach a plateau, and then you cruise at that plateau for a while, and then you hit the next rung or the next, movement upwards. And I feel like that in the profession that I'm part of, as I see it, I feel like that's what's about to happen or is happening. It's happening in little pockets, and we're just starting to bring it into the mainstream. And as the day we have this conversation, we're a number of days away from a conference I've been involved in called Advancing Research. That's part of the Rosenfeld Media Advancing Research community, which anyone is welcome to join, and I'll put a link in. And I think the name is really great. And, that we talked about sort of how do we position this conference and what does advancing research mean? And, there's lots of great stories and great work that gets shared, but we've also heard it a lot over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And, if you're new, maybe you haven't heard some of this, but there's so much stuff that we haven't heard that we need to be talking about. And you brought up ethics, earlier in this conversation as one that it's here, it's there, but we haven't really made it part of the baseline. It's not part of the kind of the core fabric of what we all practice. It's like a thing we need to do. And I feel like, as we move from the plateau to like the next incline, that we're making a collective concerted effort to bring these under-recognized pieces in. And what's exciting for me is you don't have to look very far to see, that thing that we're not really doing well, somebody is working on that. Somebody has a point of view. Somebody has built something or built a process or built a framework, and that it brings me at least an opportunity to iterate or to move to that next, that sort of 2.0, 3.0, whatever. I don't know what the numbers are, but I feel like we're on the cusp of that. And again, that is my perspective. I can't say that anyone else would feel that way, but it's something that I am drawing a lot of excitement from, because I feel like, I know how to do a lot of this stuff. And there's things that I didn't even know that I didn't know how to do. I didn't even know that I should be doing. I didn't even know our considerations. I'm not talking about, our ever shifting library of tools and infrastructure, but right. Really an iteration of best practices to be more inclusive, to be more empathetic of our colleagues. And I feel very excited about the near term, because I feel like that stuff is coming out. Yeah, I don't know how that matches with your own trajectory, which is obviously different than mine.
It's so interesting. I've been having some really great conversations with, do you know Steve Fadden? So, I think this is something that like organizations have struggled with, where what's after a senior researcher level is a little bit like there be dragons. It's like kind of easy to articulate like an associate to a researcher to a senior researcher. But, if you don't go the management route, what makes you, a principal or a staff researcher or whatever that organization calls it, the language tends to get a little mushy. And what would distinguish that senior researcher from that next level, I think, is something that we as an industry are, like, to your point, we're getting closer. We're kind of grappling with it. And it's a little tough to talk about, what are those things that really go into having that impact that would sort of denote a level beyond senior. And, this is a little beyond I think some of the title inflation that might happen in tech as well. But there's some real interesting challenges there. And I think there's also a set of unmet need here, where I've met a lot of folks that have kind of hit that plateau, and it can be a little hard, especially if they don't have a really involved manager to figure out on their own, what are those things, or how do I get the training, or how do I get the experiences to get out of my comfort zone or try the new things or be aware of the things that I don't know to figure out how to get to that next level. It can be a little bit of a glass ceiling. And to your point about inclusiveness, I think that that's also an area where bias can really creep in terms of, allowing people to express what they bring to the table and make a case for themselves that they're having that impact or however they would be measured to sort of go on to that next level. So I like that you brought that up, and it's share the perspective that'll be exciting to sort of see how we collectively grapple with some of that.
I know that just today, and again, our today is not the today of the person that's hearing this, but anyway, the research ops community just published, I think it's called like a research skills framework.
Oh, cool.
So I saw that it was posted. I haven't seen what it consists of, but whatever it contains, it validates through another source the issue that you're identifying. This is a thing that's being considered and worked on by the research community at large.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that, a lot of times companies can't share these kind of frameworks externally, which is a shame. But I love that they're able to come up with something that they can share publicly. And it's one thing I do love about this community. Like the listserv is so helpful. People pay it forward. People paid it forward to me, like yourself, when I was first coming into this field. And I've been really lucky to help a few folks here and there as they've tried to enter the field and things like that. And I just love that there's such a propensity towards knowledge sharing. And I think it's just going to benefit us all in the future. So that's one thing I am very proud of in terms of our community.
Well, I think that's an extremely positive upnote to the conversation. So yeah, thanks, Laith, for taking the time and sharing so much interesting stuff, and really for a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invite. Really fun conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening. Tell your colleagues about Dollars to Donuts and give us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can find Dollars to Donuts on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google Play and all the places where pods are cached. Visit portugal.com/podcast to get all the episodes with show notes and transcripts. And we're on Twitter at Dollars to Donuts. That's DOLLRSTODONUTS. Our theme music is by Bruce Todd.